All right, everyone. Welcome to our second virtual talk for today. I'm Michelle Young, the founder of Untapped New York, and I'm very pleased to introduce the museum at Eldridge Street's archivist and curator, Nancy Johnson, and Jewish Daily Forward archivist, Chana Pollack, and they'll be sharing about the museum at Eldridge Street's exhibition, Pressed Images from the Jewish Daily Forward, that was open before the city shut down. Readers might have seen our story about the exhibition as well when it first opened. So feel free to send questions via the chat function during the presentation. You guys are all muted for the moment. And then we'll have a larger Q&A at the end of the talk. There is a raise hand function that you'll see on your screen, and you can use that to virtually raise your hand. And when we get to the Q&A, we will unmute you and you can ask that question or continue to just post in the chat and I will ask the question on your behalf. So Nancy and Hannah, please take it away.
Okay. Thank you all for coming. I see some familiar faces here and some new ones. So thank you all for joining us. Today, we're going to take you on a virtual tour of the museum at Eldridge Street's current exhibition, which, as Michelle said, is titled Pressed Images from the Jewish Daily Forward. The museum makes its home here at the Eldridge Street Synagogue. When this building opened its doors in 1887, it was the first great house of worship built in the United States by Jews from Eastern Europe. It was at the heart of the Lower East Side of Manhattan, a bustling, overcrowded immigrant neighborhood. And the Forward newspaper was founded 10 years later in 1897, and for many years, its headquarters was just around the corner on East Broadway. The Eldridge Street Synagogue and the Forward had many things in common. They both served an immigrant population. They both focused on things that were important to newly arrived American Jews, and they both used the Yiddish language to communicate. And Hannah, since you're our Yiddish maven, would you tell us a little bit about Yiddish?
Sure. Thanks, Nancy. Shalom Aleichem, everybody. Hi. For those of you who don't know, Yiddish was the language of Eastern European Jews who belong to the part of Jewish culture that's called Ashkenazi, that was developed in Eastern and Western Europe after if you follow along Jewish history, after the expulsion from Spain. Jews settled, in the 1400s, Jews settled along the Rhine River Valley and then sort of spread into, migrated into Western and Eastern Europe. And as they were settled there, the language that developed and became their, what we call Mama Loshen, their mother tongue, was Yiddish. And it's a bit of an amalgam. It's written in Hebrew letters, but it's written phonetically, so it's spelled differently, but it uses the Hebrew aleph base, the alphabet. And it contains within it elements of High Middle German, some of the Romance languages, and of course Hebrew and Aramaic. And it became the lingua franca, really the mother tongue of the bulk of the immigrants who settled on the Lower East Side, for sure.
So the Forward, by publishing in Yiddish, was really giving the immigrant Jewish population on the Lower East Side a common news source. And that was one of the reasons that we wanted to collaborate with the Forward on this exhibition. So this is the synagogue's main sanctuary. And we were thinking as we put this show together that the images that we would be focusing on in the show would be the same images that the people who early on sat in these seats were looking at in their newspaper, and that they would be a reflection of what they were thinking about and concerned about. So if we were able to go to the museum today, this is what we would see. This is how the exhibition looks on the walls, although these people certainly are not practicing social distancing. When we were talking about the show, Hannah had the great idea to focus on a collection of vintage metal printing plates that she had in the Forward archive, which were used to print images in the paper. So we combined these plates with printed images of them, and then enlargements, which you see on the wall here, of the pages of the paper in which the images appear. This is an example of one of these metal printing plates. The plates themselves were the shape and size of the image that they would create in the newspaper. So how did this all work, and how did we get the printed images of these plates? Well, we asked Rob Wilson at the Down print shop at the South Street Seaport Museum if he would print the plates for us, which he very generously agreed to do. So here's a short video. We'll see Rob in a second. There he is in his print shop, and he'll show us how he printed the plates.
So what you're looking at there is, one of our plates, and he's securing it before he can run the press over it. So he inked it up, and now he's gonna actually run paper over it. And there you go.
So the prints that we have in the show are the ones that Rob printed for us. And then as we decided how to organize the show, we thought we would do it in thematic groups. And the first group is of images that relate to the Forward newspaper itself. So Chana, do you want to tell us about these?
Right, thanks, Nancy. So again, the Forward was founded in 1897, like Nancy said, and 1897 was quite a year. A couple of newspapers were started. I think the New York Times was actually starting to really have its place in 1897, and the world was having a lot of upheaval, and you can see that reflected in the headlines on this first page. The Forward is a progressive newspaper. It was founded by social democrats, and its headlines kind of reflect that. On the right side, they're looking at foreign policy, and there's a war going on in between Turkey and Greece. And then the second column over there in Yiddish says "Bravo Kubaner." It says, the Forward is on the side of the Cubans to overthrow Spanish rule. And then there's a story about the steam fitters that are fighting for better conditions. And then the last column over there is actually about, on the Lower East Side, how the doctors are kind of, in those days, a little bit like in Europe today still, you can go to an aptek, you can go to a pharmacy, and you can actually get, outside of prescription, you can actually get, sort of not quite examined, but you can present your complaint and actually get help from a pharmacist there. So it used to be like that on the Lower East Side back in the day, but doctors were starting to kind of impinge on that and sort of charge outrageous rates, the Forward thought, to the pharmacists. So, here was sort of an expose on that, practice. So we like to joke that through our 123 years, we're turning 123 actually tomorrow, and that the headlines haven't changed that much. And, throughout its years, we're digital now. We have been digital only, and we publish daily for the past couple of years, but that the headlines haven't changed all that much. And definitely our outlook is still progressive and on the side of, the people, and trying to present the world. The Forward's concept was that it was a socialist newspaper, but it did not want to just be a mere organ of the Socialist Party, that it was interested in bringing the news of the world and culture and art and literature and the voices of the people to the people. It did not wish to speak down to the people. It wished to elevate through education and also through, arts and culture. And it had the job of having to bring in immigrants who had come from countries where they weren't full citizens, to teach them citizenship and how to be a fully vested American citizen, including voting rights. So here we have the first image ever taken of the folks who set out that paper that we just looked at. This is the first group of typesetters for our paper in 1897. And you can probably notice there's one woman in that second row all the way on the right, and her name, thanks Nis, was Adela Keene Zametkin. And her husband was one of the founding members. He was an active, Michal Zametkin was a well-known downtown New York Jewish socialist, and she was herself an activist, a noted activist, and she came to be the treasurer slash, in those days they would say cashier, was kind of the secretary treasurer of the Forward organization, making sure the admin was kept up, that everybody got paid, which was quite a story back in the day when they were just starting out. And eventually in 1932, she herself wrote a book called The Woman's Handbook in Yiddish. And she is said to have been one of our first women writers. We eventually, in the post-1917, we started a women's page in the paper, and she was one of the first writers there. And their daughter was Laura Hobson, who actually wrote the movie that many of you may know, Gentleman's Agreement. So she came from a writing background. And we love this image because, so the paper is founded in 1897, and we've just seen what the first issue looked like. And here we are, this must be about the 1920s, 1930s. And this was what downtown New York, this is like what Newsies, if you've seen that Broadway show Newsies, folks who sold the newspaper for us and for other newspaper publications, selling them on the streets of New York was kind of a rough business. And here she's all bundled up because, there were no kiosks. You really had to be outside. She's weighted down her papers, and she's sort of guarding her turf. There were a lot of stories about, the different corners in various neighborhoods of New York, and how you had to really kind of keep guard on your space if you wanted to sell newspapers on the streets of New York. And she's one of the rare women, images of women selling our paper that we have. So we like that image. And this is Abraham Khan, known as Ab Khan, who you may have heard of. He's our founding editor. And Ab Khan was the individual who, in the beginning, the Forward was founded by a group, a collective of young socialist Yiddish speakers on the Lower East Side. And they were really interested in putting forth, there were competing sort of socialist papers. They wanted to put this one out that wasn't anarchist and wasn't too radical. They wanted to put out a socialist paper, but Ab Khan really wanted it to be more of, as I spoke before, a regular newspaper, like an English reading, newspaper in New York City would be like. He wanted to do the same thing, but for the Yiddish reading masses, and of course reflecting Jewish history and Jewish culture and Jewish concerns to them, along with news of the world. And so there was a bit of a tussle, and he left after the first couple of months in 1897, and then he came back in the early 1900s, and he assumed the leadership from, so let's say he was there from 1897, a couple of years he was away, all the way till 1951, till he died. So he actually worked, managed the paper from its opening day, right, with that 1897, that first edition that cost a penny and it was one page, all the way in the early 1900s under his leadership. The paper reached, I think, 110,000, and by the 1930s, it was the largest selling newspaper in New York at 250,000. It outpaced the New York Times at that point in the 30s. He himself was a writer and a novelist. If you've seen the movie Hester Street, about that's based on one of his novels. So we love this image. Not a lot of folks know, but some folks do remember. This is our building. It was 10 stories high, and it was completed in 1912. And we're one of the first Jewish newspapers, if perhaps the only, on East Broadway, that was known as, Jewish Newspaper Row. The other Yiddish papers were there, but the Forward actually had the wherewithal at that point in 1912, because of circulation figures under the leadership of Ab Khan. They were able to build their own building, and they were determined to make it sort of the tallest building on the Lower East Side. And at its height, they actually had what you can see in that image, are two electric 30,000 watt signs. The one that we're looking at directly says Vorwärts in Yiddish, and it faced the Williamsburg Bridge. So the joke is that, you know, folks coming over the Williamsburg Bridge from that part of Brooklyn could read the Yiddish, and folks on the other side, you can see it says Jewish Daily Forward in English, and folks coming over, you know, the Manhattan, the Brooklyn bridges could see that one. So it was a little bit of like a competition. And this is our, this is the image that you actually saw Rob printing. And we love that image for so many reasons, not least of which, of course, this is on, you know, VE Day. On the sign, the man is holding up a newspaper that says in Yiddish, Krieg geendigt in Europa. The war has ended in Europe. So, of course, for the Jewish community, that's a tremendously poignant, but also a very important day. And I believe today we're actually celebrating in Israel, it's actually a Holocaust Remembrance Day. So this picture is especially meaningful to me today. And they apparently were standing on Delancey in Essex. Maybe they were over at the old lady who was selling the papers. Maybe that's who they bought it from. We don't know. But they were hungry for news of Europe. And the Forward, of course, throughout its history, especially around World War II, was noted for having brought news through I mean, at that point, we couldn't have had correspondence, Jewish correspondence in Eastern Europe, but we were able to get word out through various organizations that we were connected to. So for instance, news of the gas chambers was first reported to us. News of Treblinka concentration camp was first reported for us. News of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which is also memorialized April 19th last week. So that type of news, you could only read about it in our paper. It wouldn't have reached the English language press for a long time after that. So Yiddish-speaking Jews were completely really dependent on our paper to know anything of what was happening with the people they may have left behind. And the other thing about this that still is you know, meaningful today is that the Forward also had listings of relatives you may have lost in the war or who were looking for you, especially with the creation of the refugees. With any of the survivors of the Holocaust, they were able to place announcements in our paper of who they knew they had in America and who they were looking for and where they had come from. And this went on in our paper all the way through the 1970s. People tell stories of how they actually reconnected families through our paper.
So the Forward also covered local news, and we were particularly interested in stories that took place on the Lower East Side, since that's where Eldridge Street is. It was sort of a self-serving interest, I suppose. But here we have a special kind of, sort of a bread line during the Great Depression.
Right. So this is actually East Broadway, which we were saying was Yiddish newspaper row. So you can see that sort of around the newspapers, other Jewish organizations grew. And if you walk down the Lower East Side today and you go visit Eldridge Street, you can still see the Forward building as a landmark building. It's condos, but right down its block, this synagogue is still there, the Young Israel. And what you're watching are, like Nancy said, this is matzah line. So it's the holiday that we just celebrated last week in April. It's an 8-day long holiday in which you're asked to abstain, sort of like a long Lent, to abstain from leavened products. So you don't eat bread or anything that's, you know, made with yeast or other leavenings, and you eat matzah to commemorate the flight of the Jewish people, you know, the Israelites out of Egypt. So it is a tradition on that holiday to offer charity to those who cannot afford matzah. So that's the line there, is they're actually waiting to receive from the community through the synagogue, you know, boxes of matzah. And on the front page of that paper, was a story about a matzah riot. So that was a matzah line that was, you know, like a bread line in the Depression, but for matzah. But on the front page, there was another story in which about 5,000 poor Jewish folks of the East Side were waiting for, there was a gentleman in Chelsea who was doing very well in his silver business, and he used to distribute cash to folks on the Lower East Side for the holiday as an act of charity. And this was, of course, in the Depression, this photo, and it was just, a riot broke out and the cops had to be called. So this one, if you're familiar with the Lower East Side, this is the inside of the Essex Street Market, which just recently closed down, the original Essex Street, and it sort of got reconfigured into like a food hall, which is very trendy right now. It's still on Essex and Houston. But here you'll see the New York City, the city government used to have a markets department. And this woman, I think Miss Cassell, was invited to come out and demonstrate for the consumers. In this case, she's on the Essex Street Market. It's the Lower East Side, and she's doing what's called a gefilte fish demonstration. Some of you may know that. It's a traditional Eastern European Jewish food made of ground fish, and the ground fish is then poached. And anyways, it's a bit of a fun thing. People always like to joke about gefilte fish, but here she is trying to convince the New York consumer, it looks like a tough crowd, that they should use pike, right? I think it's pike. She's trying to convince them to use a fish that's more readily available and more affordable. And this is also during the war. So there was a lot of work done with the consumer groups to get folks to purchase products that were more readily available to New York. And here it is. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, this is what it looked like, how it appeared on the page. So it's in the section called Interesting News and Images, and there she is on the bottom. That's how it appeared in the paper. And at this point, the forward is aware that they're raising already a second generation of folks who are children of immigrants, but they themselves are born in America. They're what we call in Yiddish dogeborene. So they're native English speakers. So as the forward is going ahead and putting more images in their paper, they're also making bilingual captions.
The forward also looked around the world to Jewish communities, even in places that might have seemed unusual, like Africa, and published lots of really beautiful photographs from these communities. And there's certainly the kinds of photographs that wouldn't have appeared in mainstream newspapers in New York. So what we're looking at here is a photograph of an Algerian family in a sukkah, which is a sort of temporary hut that's made for the fall festival of Sukkot. And the little black marks that you see above and below the picture were made in the printing process by those clips that Rob used to fasten the plates down into the printing press. And then this is a story about Ethiopia, which I will ask Chana to tell us about.
So the headline here, this is during the war also, and they're talking about Abyssinia has been taken back, but the Italians have now taken Adova, another a large city in Ethiopia. And so we thought it was a really, first of all, we thought it was just a beautiful photo. It looks like a studio photo. And we thought it was really amazing that on the top, they were talking about foreign policy, the war, politics, you know, the spread of fascism into Ethiopia, and here by, you know, through Italy invading, and here they're also showing the Yiddish reader that, you know, the Jews are a diverse community, and here is a group of Ethiopian Jews. So, you know, it's true that our focus at this time is primarily on the Ashkenazi Jews of Eastern and Central Europe who are undergoing terrible, terrible situation in the Holocaust, and as it spread to Western Europe. But the forward is also still very dedicated to the larger education of the Jewish readership to understand the breadth of the Jewish people, and that includes Jews of color. And this one we love because it's this is actually a replication of the front page in 1948 with the founding of the State of Israel, which was a pivotal moment for Jews all over. And so the forward spent the money on the red ink and the large supersized type. And the headline we loved, it says, America anerkennt neue Yiddische Melucha Yisrael. America recognizes the new state of Israel, and in quotes, the new state, in quotes, Israel. In other words, they're also telling the readership, this new state that we have, this new Jewish state, here's the name, it's going to be called Israel. And this one we just loved in trying to explain to the readership what the actual, real life boundaries are and borders for the country of Israel. We just thought this was such a great graphic, in terms of all the different shadings and colors. And what they're doing is they're teaching everybody geography of the Middle East. So here you have Iran, Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Lebanon, Israel, Transjordan, Egypt, Sudan, Yemen, Aden, Oman, and Saudi Arabia. And they're all kind of given different gradations and shadings. And this one was actually a newsstand in the new state of Israel. And you can see on the top is Haaretz. That's one of the more progressive newspapers still publishing in Israel. And the forward has a long-time relationship with that paper. And as you sort of go down the newsstand, you can see the Jerusalem Post, what used to be called the Palestine Post under the British. It's also a long-time English language paper in Israel. And then Aufbau, which I think published in New York, was a German Jewish paper of much regard. It no longer publishes. But there's the forward. And that was really interesting to us because you may not know, but there was a lot of politics over language in Israel and which language was actually going to be the lingua franca of the country. And of course, Yiddish did not win that battle. And consequently, there was a lot of cultural fighting over that. And there was actually a government organized group to make, like a lot of countries have, about the proper use of the language. The BBC does it for England, and in Canada we have it over French. But here in Israel, the fight was between Hebrew and Yiddish, and so Yiddish theaters were officially locked up, and some of the actors were even thrown into jail. And there's stories about kiosks that sold Yiddish papers, like the forward, that were set on fire. So this went on for quite a while in the beginning of the state. And go ahead.
The forward used photographs to great effect to sort of telegraph their political leanings and the kinds of people that they were interested in as thought leaders. Here we have Emma Goldman, the anarchist. And didn't the forward publish her memoir?
We did. We published her memoirs. We published Trotsky's memoirs when he was hanging around New York. And I think the caption that we loved about Emma Goldman, when they were announcing, that they were going to serialize her memoirs in the paper, it was something like, you're never going to believe these memoirs. They sound like something you would never read in the most action-packed novel. So, that was their way of enticing folks to come and read Emma Goldman's true life adventures. And in the 50s, when Golda Meir was the foreign minister of Israel, she oversaw the Israel's United Nations representation. So here she is at the UN, where it was like a meeting of two great minds. That's Eleanor Roosevelt on the left and Golda Meir. And Eleanor Roosevelt at the time had her own syndicated column. I think it was called The Day, maybe. And
My Day.
My Day. The Day. My Day. And in it, she remarked upon Golda Meir as, do you know the quote?
She said that a woman cannot help but deeply respect and love her.
Golda Meir.
So clearly they had a very good relationship, which I think is evident from this photograph. It's pretty clear that the forward was a fan of the Kennedys. Here we see Senator Kennedy in 1958 speaking to a synagogue group in Chelsea, Massachusetts on the 10th anniversary of Israel. And Chana was saying the other day that she thinks that this is the only photograph she's ever seen of him wearing a kippah or a yarmulke. This was before his run for president. And then during his run for president, we have his biggest asset, probably Jackie, meeting with Anthony Akers, who was the chairman of the Citizens Committee for Kennedy and Johnson. And she apparently was, clearly she did not read Yiddish, but she was very taken with the paper and asked for a copy to take home as a memento. And there we see her in the, as her photograph was published in the paper. And this is the front page of the paper on the day after the 1960 presidential election. Chana, would you tell us about
Right.
what
So
it says?
yeah, we love the headlines. It's Kennedy ruft alle Amerikaner zu schließende Reihen, starken Land und arbeiten verschulden. Kennedy asked all Americans to close ranks, help strengthen the country, and work for peace. And we especially loved right underneath, you can see on the front page, right? It's a picture of Jackie on the right, and I'm imagining Caroline, and JFK on the left, but the caption we loved was the neue President mit seiner Familie. And underneath, they use the more homey term in Yiddish to describe the president's family. And they say, this is the new mishpacha in the White House. This is the new, you know, and if you're around New York or the Jewish communities of the major metropolitan areas, you probably are familiar with the term mishpacha. I think it's made it into the American speech. I've seen it on TV and in movies. It's, you know, when you feel close to somebody as if they're your own family, you offer them that they're mishpacha. So the forward is, you know, signaling to the readerships that we're gonna support this new mishpacha in the White House. And the forward also had a radio station. You can see the call letters there, WEVD. It stood for famous socialist leader Eugene V. Debs, and big supporter of the forward. And the forward supported Eugene V. Debs as he ran for president, I think 4 times, unsuccessfully, obviously, and once even from prison. But he was a major force in shaping, you know, the socialist movement in the United States. And we named our radio station after him, and it was known as the station that speaks your language, because it broadcast to the readership in Yiddish. And one of the important, it had many, many programs, but one of the most important functions it had, you can see here, is to offer the readership a chance to get to know who the politicians were, and to keep teaching the readership to participate fully as fully vested Americans with their voting rights was a really important function of the paper and also the radio station.
Part of the forward's commitment to public service journalism and to social justice was its coverage of protests where citizens went out and spoke their minds about things that they thought were important. And it wasn't just on the Lower East Side. If you're familiar with Manhattan, you might recognize this as Columbus Circle. And this was an unemployment riot that took place in 1932. Chana, could you tell us about this?
I think this is like May Day. May 1st was like a tremendous, you can look at the crowds. We just love this for the crowds. It's a tremendous celebration of, you know, pardon me?
And the cheerleaders.
Right. The women in front are cheerleaders. May Day was like a big field day. There were track and field races. There were dances. I think this took place at Randall's Island, typically. And all the unions and the workers, everybody came out. There were speeches. It was a very uplifting kind of day. And you can see that people are just having a blast. And we love that this is what cheerleaders for the labor movement used to look like. I think you can see the megaphones on their shirts, and they're clearly doing some kind of cheer.
This is a picture of a strike, a baker's strike. You can see the Silver Cup Bakery is mentioned in the sign on the right-hand side. That was, for a long time, a big feature in Queens. We just loved the look on these guys' faces, the determination as they were protesting for what they thought they deserved. And then here's another kind of strike. This is a rent strike that took place in the Bronx in 1932. Police tried to evict 17 tenants from a working class Eastern European Jewish neighborhood, and about 4,000 people participated in this rent riot. The result was that the evicted families were allowed to stay and even got a reduction in their rent. So this protest sparked other similar acts of resistance in other neighborhoods.
So right after the war, there was the, United States has always had shifting quotas. So at that point, it's very difficult. It's not easy to get into United States, and the Jewish world has a tremendous refugee issue for all folks who, if you managed to survive the Holocaust and you weren't able to come to America, you didn't want to go back to Europe, obviously that was not an option for many, many folks. So a lot of folks wanted to immigrate to Israel. At that point, the point of this image, Israel is not yet a state, a recognized state. And so this is one of the first demonstrations that we know of in New York. This is at Madison Square Park. And folks it's 250,000 people turned out, and with the leadership of the labor movement in New York. So a lot of the labor leaders, Abraham Khan came out for this too, and they're asking the British government, specifically the mandate over British Palestine. At that point, they're asking them to permit these people who actually survived the war to permit more refugees to enter what was in Palestine. And we were also really taken away by this image of the folks at the demonstration. It was also one of the first parochial schools for Jews in the city, the Hebrew High School there, and other labor Zionist groups. And the other thing that's important to remember at this point is, I don't know if you're watching the Philip Roth show, The Plot Against America, but you've got to imagine that, even Jews in New York, we've just come through the Holocaust, and it's not like it's easy to come out and be openly that Jewish in New York. Even though, you have the Lower East Side and you've got the Forward newspaper and you've got a lot of freedoms, it's still kind of iffy. New York, right before World War II and before the United States entered the war, there were mass Nazi, the American Nazi, the German, the Bund, the American Nazi Party had rallied at Madison Square Garden. Lindbergh himself, of course, an American flying hero, had come out, he was pretty much pro-Nazi. He had received an award from Hitler. So, and there were neighborhoods, that Jews were not welcome in, and not to hang around, and definitely not to move out, to the suburbs. That wasn't going to happen yet, because they weren't, people weren't going to sell them homes, and they weren't welcome out there. So it was still kind of, and there were certainly jobs on the job front. There were many jobs that were not open for Jews. So when we look at this mass protest, it's kind of, mind-blowing just for how brave they were to come out.
So the Forward also spends a lot of pages on the arts, on literature, on theater, on movies, on sports. So we'll take look at a few images from those kinds of topics. Here we see Isaac Bashevis Singer, who wrote for the Forward throughout his career. This image itself is a little bit damaged. You'll see it's kind of pockmarked around his glasses. That was just in the plate itself. It wasn't any kind of an attempt to make an editorial comment on this great writer. But he was one of many, many well-known writers who wrote for the Forward, and his literature was also printed and serialized in the Forward. Yiddish theater was also a big, and Yiddish and movies in Yiddish were a big topic of conversation in the paper. Here we see a shot from a movie called Yiddle Mitten Fiddle, which came out in around 1936. And it was the most successful Yiddish movie in history. It starred Molly Picon, who we see in the middle with the violin, a small woman. She's dressed here as a boy. The plot of the story involved her dressing as a boy so she could travel with her father as a musician. And then during her tour, she falls in love with a boy, and hilarity ensues. But Molly was a darling of Yiddish theater. Here we see a 2-page ad from the Forward for a showcase, a show for her called Hello, Molly. And here is one of the pictures from that advertisement. And Here she's again impersonating a man, that's Molly on the left-hand side. She's trying to dissuade this singer in the middle from falling in love with her father, who is pictured on the right. And the actor playing her father is actually her husband, right, Anna?
Yeah, that's Jacob Kalish. And just to sort of go reference back to the fact that it is Holocaust Memorial Day in Israel today, and also to what we just talked about that protest and, you know, refugees and immigrants and the forward readership after World War II. Molly Picon and Jacob Kalish were much beloved, as Nancy said, and they were equally more beloved when they were among the first Yiddish actors to travel from New York to the displaced person camps where refugees and survivors of the Holocaust could sort of regroup in various places in Western Europe. So they actually traveled there, and they were among the first Yiddish theatrical performers, and possibly sometimes the first Yiddish that people had heard after the war when they got to one of these camps. So they were really thought of very highly, not just for their performing talents, but also for how much they gave back to the community.
Later in her career, Molly also appeared in Hollywood films, including as Yenta, the matchmaker in the original film version of Fiddler Around the Room. Other Yiddish theater stars who were well known in the English-speaking community were Eddie Cantor. We see him here. We wanted to include him because he was born Isidore Iskowitz to a Yiddish-speaking family who lived at 19 Eldridge Street, which was right across the street from the Eldridge Street Synagogue. Another of those was, another Yiddish-speaking actor was Edward G. Robinson. We see him here with Ab Khan. And he took the G initial in his name from his birth name, Goldingers. Sports was another topic that was covered in the forward, although in its earliest years, their sports coverage focused more on things like chess and fishing than things we would think of as sports, sort of mainstream sports. But in 1909, Khan decided that it was time that immigrant readers knew something about baseball, because baseball was a way of fitting in, of understanding Americans. And although this article here is called The Rules of Baseball for the Non-Sports Fan, and the writer says that although it seems very odd to an immigrant, and although this photograph of a baseball diamond here looks like some sort of Kabbalistic symbol or something, the article explains the rules of the game in terms of, in kind of political terms, where there's the defense party and the enemy party, meaning the opposing team, and that the batter finds the thrown ball with his stick and sends it flying. And they also talk about rivalries between cities as being political, but it was considered a very important thing to really understand how baseball all worked. By the 1920s, the paper actually covered games themselves, and they took a special shine to Jewish players. Here on the left, we see Andy Cohen, who played for the New York Giants in 1926, or he was signed in 1926 and played in the 20s. And he had kind of legendary status, and at the Polo Grounds, there was a treat served to the people who went to watch the games, and it was called Ice Cream Cohen's after him. We thought that was kind of cute. And on the right-hand side, we see Sandy Koufax, who, of course, was the legendary Dodger pitcher. He made headlines in just about every newspaper across the country except the Forward in 1965, when he refused to play a World Series game because it fell on Yom Kippur. Boxing also received a lot of coverage in the 1920s when this photograph on the left here appeared. That's Sid Terrace. Nearly 1/3 of prize fighters were Jewish. Jack Dempsey, who was the heavyweight champion then, said, I'm part English, part Irish, part Italian, and part Jewish, and that makes me 100% American. And the kind of ridiculous photo on the right-hand side is a man named the Mighty Adam, who was a Polish-born strongman who was known for pulling 32-ton trucks and for biting chains in half with his teeth. And he claimed to have studied Jewish mystical writings to overcome any sort of physical limitations that he might have had. And we're going to finish up with this article about the Fleischer brothers, who were animators. Chana, would you tell us what the headline said, because it's so funny?
Right, right. So just like how the foreword sort of described baseball for its readerships, with, you could say, just a little bit of skepticism, or, you know, sort of looking from the outside a little bit. Here's how they try to describe in a headline what animations are about. So the headline says, Wie soll werden gemacht, the moving pictures, mit dem verschiedenen menschlichen und chayalach. How moving pictures are made, how the movies are made with the crazy little people and like those little animal-like thing, you know. And then they actually devote like nearly a column's worth of, you know, text to describing, well, they're kind of like people, but they're not quite people, and they're sort of like animals, but they do these things. And then they actually go into a great, incredible amount of technical detail. And that's the middle passage that you saw there with all it's teaching people how animation actually works, and how many drawings you need in order to be able to create movement on film. And then, of course, they go into the description of who the Fleischer brothers were, and where they had come from, and they were immigrants to the United States, and what their Jewish background was.
And how they were just as good as Walt Disney, whose Mickey Mouse was then kind of in competition with the Fleischers. But the Fleischer Brothers animation style, as you can see here, was kind of a bit grittier than Disney. We have a very urban looking scene. We have not exactly Disney princesses here. It's a little bit more gritty than that. And here we have the image that Chana was referencing before that shows how animation works. And we thought that we would end with this, which was put together by Joanna Goldfeld, who's the exhibition and graphic designer that we worked with on this show. And during this isolation period, she's been doing a series that she's called The Art of Social Distancing. So she took our bimbo character here, who is walking, you know, showing how he would be animated, and she has social distanced him so he can be out there in public today. So that's about it. And we're hoping that when we're open again, that you will come and visit us for real. So thank you all for coming.
All right, so we're going to open it up to Q&A. I've got a couple questions that came in through the chat, so we'll ask those first, and then if anyone wants to ask a question verbally, please use the raise hand function so I can unmute you, or you can continue posting in the chat. So Howard asks, how did the forward escape the House Un-American Committee of the late 40s and 50s?
That's probably a more complex story, but let's just say the short answer is some people did, some people didn't. But there had always been a rivalry between the Freiheit, was the extremely well-known communist identified paper, the Yiddish paper, and the Forward. And early in the day, that was one thing that Ab Khan, the founding editor, was extremely determined to do, was to present socialism, not communism. And so there were many bitter and bloody battles, but the Forward was determinedely not communist. So it didn't have as much problems as the other more left-leaning Yiddish papers did. That's the short answer.
Okay, great. And then I believe Jack had a question. Did the Fords ever discuss Jewish gangsters of the Lower East Side?
Oh, absolutely. You're talking probably about Murder Inc. Yes, absolutely. I get asked that question quite a bit. I would say that from the get-go, the Forward discussed Jew on Jew crime. They did not shy away from that. Some people accuse the Forward of being a little bit on the side of yellow journalism in the fact that they would put those stories front and center, front page, frequently above the fold, not just below the fold on the front page. And they definitely talked about it. They weren't, the whole idea of the Forward was not, they were not interested in being a paper that didn't reflect back to the Jewish people what was actually going on, the reality of how ugly things got to. They definitely talked about it, and that is what some people say why we're still around today, because it was actually a real newspaper. It wasn't about to just sugarcoat things.
Lori asks in comments, I've seen photos of Hitler burning an effigy around 1936 to 37 on East Broadway. How aware was the Jewish community of Nazi atrocities?
Extremely aware. From what I know, the Forward started reporting on it in the 1920s already, about the rise of fascism. So, and I have some of those photos in our archive too, from very early 1930s demonstrations by the Yipsels, the Young People Socialist League at Union Square, with really beautiful, I hate to say it, I mean, it was an effigy of Hitler, so I don't really care how beautiful it was, but it was actually very artfully created, and they had beautifully hand-lettered signs. So they were very well aware. And of course, a lot of our readership still had family back in the countries that were being directly affected by it. So they were well aware.
One of the places that I've been, you mentioned the Madison Square Garden anti and pro Nazi rallies, but I've also been to the town on Long Island, which had the German settlement. You've probably seen some pictures of that, and it's a fascinating place because it's still predominantly German. You can see the parade ground. There used to be trains coming out from Penn Station to bring people to those parades, and so yeah, fascinating place. I'll send the link to that in the chat as well. Do we have any other questions from the group? So some people asked about how to donate to both Eldridge Street and the Forward. So I posted the direct links for the donations there.
Thank you.
And we'll be sending an email to everyone who registered for this talk. And with those links and a video of the talk once we have that processed. And one last question, Lori says, on East Broadway near Forward, named after Titanic survivors, did you cover that?
Did we cover the Titanic? Absolutely. Not only did we,
she asked if it was covered heavily.
yes, absolutely. In fact, I love that image of the front page of us are reporting on the Titanic so much that like I can tell you what it looked like. It was an image of women and children who had been saved and were brought to New York to the Jewish, it was at the time it was called like the Jewish Hospitality House. I think it was an early forerunner of an immigrant aid society, and they were housed there. They were brought here from Halifax, and the Jewish community gathered around and took people in until they could sort of regroup. So we covered it extensively. Abkan wrote a raging editorial about the problems of capitalism in trying to create a ship where the engineering was so suspect, but the company itself wanted to break a record of speed, and that was the problem, and no oversight in the industry. It was all about money. We were on top of that story. Yeah, no question about it. And we actually did on the centennial of it, right? That just happened recently. We did a special historical insert translating our original materials. You can probably find it online, or you can email me and I'll send you the link.
Great, and a couple of people asked how long the exhibition will be up. They're hoping it'll be up when we're out of this.
Yes, it will be. We had intended to take it down this week, actually, but it will be, since we're really not sure when we'll reopen at this point, it's hard to say, but it will be up when we reopen, and it will be up for a while when we reopen. So I would imagine at least until the fall. but who knows?
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you both, Nancy and Chana. This was very informational. I learned a lot, and I think everyone did as well. So best of luck during this time, and we'll see you when this is over. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks.
Bye, everyone.